Welcome to this theory lecture on Karl Marx. So, Marx theory is probably the most influential social science theory when it comes to real-world impact. Revolutionaries of different kinds have used Marx theory to organize social movements, to organize union movements, but also to instigate regime changes. And one of the major regime types of the 20th century, the real existing socialist regimes, was justified with Marx theories. Karl Marx was originally not received very well in academic sociology. So thinkers as Max Weber or Durkheim only implicitly referred to Marx and what they perceived as the historical materialism. It was due to Werner Sombart, whom we will briefly talk about in the Weber lecture, that the term capitalism, and Marx's writings started to be received also by academic sociologists. Marx and Marx theory then had their apogee, one could say, in sociology in the student movement of 68 generation, 60s, 70s, then faded again and had a revival after the crisis of 2008 with movements such as Occupy Wall Street, but also academic sociology, rereading then Marx's work in light of the crisis. So in this lecture, I would first like to give you a little bit of an historical overview of Karl Marx. Many of you will have prior knowledge on Marx, so I will confront some of this prior knowledge of yours with a bit of a different interpretation of Marx's work when compared to the one that you usually encounter in sociological textbooks. In sociological textbooks, Marx is usually represented as a determinist, a very structuralist thinker. And in what I will present you, also based on the manifesto reading for today, I would like to emphasize much more also the action theory in Marx's writings. So let's start out with some historical background on Karl Marx. So reading Marx is a little bit difficult, given that it is both a theory, but it is also a political program, a manifesto, as the one that you read for today. And it has also been used to create political systems. So whenever you read Marx, you can sort of use different lenses, and you can use it to organize a social movement if you wish so. You can also simply read it as a theory that, for instance, criticizes the liberal tradition that we talked about last week. There's, for this very same reason, also a little caveat here about the secondary literature, which is enormous. No one can read it here. Leszek Kolakowski here has written a 3-volume piece on the different currents of Marxism, so thought somehow based on Marx theory. And this is only a 3-volume work, not speaking of all the secondary literature out there. And one has to be a little bit careful when interpreting this secondary literature, because it is often influenced, obviously, by who wrote it, in which role, and also under which regime. So as a lot of Marxist writing has been used also to justify political regimes, many of the interpretations were not necessarily done with, let's say, an interest in finding out what the historical Karl Marx really wanted to say in his writings, but rather with the purpose of organizing a political system. So this is something you should keep in mind. Then there's also a little caveat beforehand here about the different editions, even that serve as a reference of Marx's writings. Marx published a number of works during his lifetime, most notably probably the Manifesto and Das Kapital, but just the first volume, and some translations of it. But many and even most of his writings were never published during his lifetimes and not authorized. And even when it comes to the Capital, there were several editions during his lifetime, but also after his death in 1883. So there are different versions, even of the Capital. And the non-published writings of his are also in need of, let's say, editing decisions that have to be taken into account. So here we have what is referred to also as the Marx-Engels complete volumes, or in German abbreviation then MEGA. And just a little bit of background here. This first complete edition was started in the 1920s, actually, but was not finished then. And this is referred to also as the MEGA 1. Then here in East Berlin, actually, the Marx-Engels writings, MEW here, which you probably know for this bluish kind of color of the volumes, was edited between 1956 and 1990. And last but not least, there has been a new attempt of editing the complete volumes, the so-called MEGA 2 project, which is still ongoing, and which is, I think, somehow editing Marx excerpts he took when working in the British Library and studying petrochemics, or also many of his letters are still in the phase of being edited. And this will eventually be also the probably volume of reference that you should be using, at least in the German original. And when you use a translation, be aware of what is the underlying source. And this is important because as I said, the background of editors also influenced which version of Marx's text was eventually used. And this is particularly important because there's a tendency that starts with the late Engels, actually, and him editing the Capital, but also reaching into the international Marxist movement, and also the basically state socialism, Marxism. So a tendency to de-Hegelize Karl Marx, that is, to eradicate from his writings everything that is reminiscent of Hegelianism and Hegel's sort of expressions even. Yeah. So when you use the first edition of the Capital and the second one being edited by Engels, and you will notice already in the first chapter a strong tendency of Engels' editions to eradicate many of these philosophically sounding Hegelian terms. Yeah. So this is important to keep in mind because it influences also the interpretation, and in sociology, the interpretation of Marx is often that of a very structuralist Marx, with very deterministic laws in history. And when you read the non-de-Hegelized versions, you will find, I think, much more of the action theory in Marx's writing, and I will get to this also in this lecture. Another little problem with these writings, including the manifesto, is Marx equals to Engels or not? Yeah, in some of the writings, like the manifesto, they both figure as authors. In many others, Engels is somehow in the background. And in yet others, after Marx's death, Engels also became an author, an independent author himself. And I think it is fair to say that many of Engels' writings, his own writings, differed from Marx's ideas, with a tendency again to read a lot of, let's say, stronger versions of historical materialism, of deterministic laws, of natural sciences as an ideal into Karl Marx, such that the late Engels is in a way a different author. Yeah? So also something to keep in mind. Another background condition, which is a little bit strange for readers of our days, is that Marx and Engels were raised in a philosophical tradition in the idealist movement in Germany, during which it was normal to think about theories as huge systems. And we will see also during this lecture what this entails. But it basically was a universalist strive to offer, in a way, one coherent set of propositions that explains, in a way, history in the course of all things, that encompasses anthropology, all different kind of sciences, and that at the time also was marked by a teleological structure. So the idea of history having a tellus, a certain goal towards which it is oriented. And this was, in a way, you could say, the style of the time to develop theories in. Marx is probably also the social science thinker who, let's say, ends this kind of tradition. All of our next social science thinkers probably don't follow these ideas. We have a system theory in the 20th century as well, which is perhaps reminiscent again of this tradition in German idealism, but it is a much more modernized version of it, I would say. Another important aspect regarding Marx's works in general is whether they are even a coherent whole or not. And there's this idea of a discontinuity thesis defended by, again, many of the, let's say, state socialist Marxists, the international Marxists, that says that there's a clear cut between the early, more philosophical Marx and the later scientific Marx, yeah, the one that discovered political economy as a subject, whereas the early Marx, more of a poet and philosopher perhaps, was not really, let's say, the point of reference. Against this discontinuity thesis, there is the continuity thesis, obviously, which says that the main element of the early Marx can also be found in the late Marx. The discontinuity thesis has a bit of a problem to determine when the early Marx becomes the late Marx. And the cut is being made as late as even after the Kapital. But usually the idea is that the Kapital is somehow different from the writings of the 1840s, so the German ideology, but also the manifesto. So in one reading, what you read for today then, the manifesto is, according to some at least, just the early Marx. In what I will present today, I will rather follow a continuity thesis. It is also important to keep in mind that there's a difference between Marx and Marxism. So Marxism, as for instance, depicted here in the many currents of Marxism that have developed in history. So Marxism somehow refers to Marx's writings, obviously, to merit and earn the name, but it may obviously differ from, let's say, the interpretations that Marx has given to his own texts. So just referring to Marx in Marxism may differ from the interpretations that are determined by Marx's writings. There are so many different currents in Marxism, obviously, because Marx's writings are very colorful.